So thank you very much and welcome to day 2 of Securing Our Future. And I would echo the acknowledgement of country. It's been a really, I think, powerful day so far. Yesterday is our debut with this conference, and many of you I know were at the dinner last night with a speech by the Foreign Minister, making some very significant policy announcements and framing of policy that's had a lot of media attention. And that's all very much in the spirit of what we're trying to achieve here at Securing Our Future, which is really to help drive and generate the national conversation that we believe Australia needs to ensure that we're prepared for not only the challenging times we live in, but challenging and confronting times ahead. So for the next session, it's my pleasure to welcome another very special guest, and that is the Shadow Minister for Defence, Andrew Hastie, the Honourable Andrew Hastie, who's been formerly Minister, who's formerly been a Chair of Parliamentary Committees, who's, of course, significant experience as a soldier, an officer in the Australian Army and the Australian Defence Force. I'm going to invite Andrew Hastie to give some remarks on leadership, because that's a theme that underpins much of what we think about here at the National Security College, but hasn't been an explicit theme of the conference so far. And then I'm going to invite Andrew Hastie for a conversation not only about leadership, but also the question about national morale, indeed mobilisation in the sense of national morale. So can you please join me in welcoming Andrew Hastie to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Rory. It's great to be here. Thank you for hosting me. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to address you this morning. We seem to be in a fog. Almost everyone here knows it. We head into briefings about the threats to our security, from foreign interference and espionage to cyber and strategic coercion. And the threat assessments are chilling. But when we walk out of those secure meeting rooms, we act like nothing's wrong. We prepare generic public statements and no one is moved. We miss our recruiting targets, no new ships are built, and our dialogue with our most trusted friends and allies, to quote one ambassador, is languishing. We're sluggish to the point of apathy. And why is that? In 1963, President John F. Kennedy gave a speech conferring honorary citizenship on a man his father had ridiculed for being a warmonger, but whom he himself admired, and that man was Winston Churchill. JFK said, "In the dark days and darker nights when England stood alone, and most men save Englishmen despaired of England's life, he mobilised the English language and sent it into battle." And that's the problem, isn't it? We're not moving because we haven't mobilised our language. We need a change of language, and it must start here in the halls of learning. We all need to bring something, and this morning I've brought with me a 1,300-year-old Nordic fighter given new life by the contemporary feminist author Maria de Varna Headley and her punchy translation of Beowulf. In 2020, Headley gave the world a fresh look at the Swedish warrior of the 6th century. And with new eyes, we saw his passionate devotion to his Danish ally, Hrothgar. We saw the existential threat they both faced from a hell dweller known as Grendel, a dark, terrifying enemy. And for all of us here who care about defending this great nation that we love, protecting our democracy, and securing our future, I think her work is a gift that spits truth. Its language shakes us awake. It has the feel of a populist poem, as she notes in her introduction. Now, there are two other translations to consider alongside hers: J.R.R. Tolkien's 1926 work and Nobel Prize laureate Seamus Heaney's grand epic from the year 2000. Hedley finished hers during the pandemic in 2020. And so she writes in her introduction, "Beowulf depicts edge times and border wars, and we're still in them." Her work has an edginess to it, and she grabs you by the scruff of the neck with the first word, bro, bro. While Tolkien translates the first word of the story as low, and Heaney begins with so, Hedley starts with the word she heard so often when she was serving beers in bars, bro. Beowulf is an epic poem about us, living, breathing people right here, right now. It's about the human condition and our universal quest for security and peace. And while Hedley's Beowulf is courageous and powerful, he is vulnerable and flawed too. When he first fights the monster, it hurts. Knuckles buckled, joints unjoined. And like so much ancient literature, Beowulf holds out enduring lessons. And for us in the defence community, almost immobilised by foggy language, it pushes us to take two bold steps. Step one, to use clear language in articulating our threats, our objectives, and strategic direction. Step two, to speak more honestly with the Australian people about our vulnerabilities, about the threat, and about the need to arm, so there's a social licence in our defence policy. Step one, use clear language in national security leadership. Let's be open here. Throughout our history, Australia has enjoyed the strategic protection of a dominant, English-speaking democratic power. At Federation, we enjoyed protection from the United Kingdom and the benefits of Pax Britannica. That protection was challenged in the First World War by Germany and ended sharply and brutally in February 1942 with the fall of Singapore at the hands of the Japanese Imperial Forces. Prime Minister John Curtin, only a month later, gave a speech in March of 1942, broadcast on Radio Australia, signalling that Australia looked to America as the paramount factor on democracy's side in the Pacific. A very nice and clear message. Since then, we have enjoyed protection from the United States as we wove ourselves into the post-war order of Pax Americana. This protection has not come without cost, though. Like all areas of life, there are trade-offs. One of the trade-offs for enjoying the benefits of Pax Britannica and Pax Americana is that we have been obliged to defend those respective orders with our blood and with our treasure. To be blunt, we have defended the values and interests of our senior partners with more than 100,000 Australian lives over the last century. We wish that the world was a safer place. We do. But security is never final, and complacency is almost always fatal. For the United States, the dilemmas of dominance are more acute and urgent than ever before. From the Red Sea to Israel and Gaza, from Ukraine to the Taiwan Strait, we are seeing breakouts of strategic disorder across the globe. And they matter to Australia as we feel the impact and see the fractures to Pax Americana. Authoritarian powers and their proxies are on the move. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Hamas, Houthi rebels, to name a few, undermine the order that underwrites our peace and our prosperity. And we all know that China is undergoing the biggest peacetime military build-up since the end of the Second World War. That's not a secret. It's not a secret at all. But behind closed doors, the analytical consensus is clear. We are facing a grave and deteriorating strategic situation. But disturbingly, there is a vast gap between the closed-door analytical consensus inside government and the public conversation that the Albanese government should be leading. Worse, ministers of the Crown use obscure and bureaucratic language when talking to the Australian people about our threats and challenges. But everyone here in this room knows that language matters. We're being let down. The language we currently hear is everything that George Orwell warned about in his 1946 essay, politics, and the English language. He called such language pure wind. Let's start with the phrase preventive architecture. This is the language used in a keynote address at ASEAN by a cabinet minister, and we heard it again last night from the same minister. Preventive architecture. What does that actually mean? It sounds more like strategic contraception than it does deterrence. No one really knows. It is, as Orwell says, largely of euphemism, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Next, consider this phrase, this time from the Deputy Prime Minister only last week at the Sydney Institute. The man charged with explaining what deterrence means said this: "It means having the capability to engage in impactful projection through the full spectrum of proportionate response." I don't know about you, but I can visualize nothing at all, except maybe President Josiah Bartlett asking a stunned White House Situation Room about the virtue of a proportional response. And for the West Wing tragics in the room, that's season 1, episode 3. This sort of language is pure wind. But try this for an image. Beowulf confronts Grendel, the monster nursing a hard grievance. He cannot use his sword in hand-to-hand combat, nor can his men use their ancestral blades, as no blade on earth could ever damage their opponent. So Beowulf waits in his bed for Grendel to attack him. He uses surprise and grips his arm so tightly that he cannot escape. As Headley writes, his bones cracked, but he could not wrestle free from the clasp, war-wedded to a woe-bringer, who clung like no human ever clung, keeping him close. Beowulf tears off Grendel's arm, who retreats and dies in his lair, his hourglass emptied by the struggle. Can you see that image? I can see it, and I see the point. We can't rely on old ways of thinking, our ancestral blades, if we hope to deter our adversaries. We must discover our own asymmetric, vice-like grip, so that if we are attacked one day, we can surprise and tear the arm off an adversary. And we hope Pillar 2 of AUKUS yields plenty of asymmetric, vice-like grips. If our friends from Japan join us in that quest, we will be stronger for it. But our people need a strategic narrative more potent than preventive architecture or impactful projection to help them get there. That's step 1. Step 2, to speak more honestly with the Australian people so that there's a social licence in defence policy. A failure of defence advocacy to the Australian public has consequences. It puts our greatest endeavours, like the Quad security dialogue and AUKUS, at risk. Shingo Yamagami, recently Japan's ambassador to Australia, wrote an open letter this week saying that since he left the country he had come to love, he has rarely heard the foreign minister even mention the word Quad when she speaks publicly. Mr. Yamagami said that because of our current vague language, the security dialogue with India, the United States and Japan, which Australia once led, is now languishing. The Defence Minister needs to speak openly too about AUKUS. We need to talk about the money required to fund AUKUS, the new basing requirements for the submarines in Perth, and the housing that needs to be built for US and UK families posted to Australia in support of AUKUS. We need to talk about nuclear reactors, their operation, maintenance, and disposal. Instead, we see the government refusing to discuss nuclear power at the very time they need to be open about it. Once Labor assented to nuclear submarines, they depth charged their own opposition to a civil nuclear industry. Now they find themselves unable to talk about submarines and the nuclear industry we need to support it. And social licence is built through ongoing public advocacy. And for that reason, I applaud Professor Medcalf and his fresh initiative of nationwide community consultations on security. It is vital work. But Rory, your initiative doesn't let the Deputy Prime Minister off the hook, I'm afraid. It is his job to lead the conversation, the national conversation on defending our shores. Nothing is more vital to securing our future than AUKUS, but a failure of this government's advocacy will put it at risk. There is a recruitment and retention crisis in the Australian Defence Force. We are not recruiting enough people, and people are leaving for other career paths. This comes at a time when we should be growing towards our 2040 target of an additional 18,500 men and women in uniform. And this failure of advocacy has ominous consequences. Weakness is provocative, and I think the historical record reflects this. We don't want a future Prime Minister ever repeating John Curtin's words of 1942, where he said this, and I quote, "We, the Allied nations, were unready. We have all made mistakes. We have all been too slow. We have all shown weakness, all the Allied nations. Now our eyes are open. We don't want our eyes opened by war." And right now, the Albanese government is weak at articulating the threats that we face, weak at communicating our strategy to defeat those threats, weak at advocating for resources and capability that we need in the years ahead. Now is not the time for vague language. Vague language means vague goals. How can we defeat our national threats if no one is clear about what the threat is? And we must, therefore, shake ourselves from this apathy. As we provide national security leadership, we must speak plainly about the threats. We must avoid pure wind. We must speak more honestly with the Australian people so Defence has the social licence it needs to build its capability. So I urge you to dig deep into literature and history to find the new language that we need. I found it in the feminist translation of Beowulf. I picked that up in 2022 at Kramer's Bookshop on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., a great little bookshop. And when Beowulf speaks to assure the leaders of countries in his region, he doesn't use vagaries. He says with clarity, "I knew my plan when I set off for this coast. Before I put my band in that boat, already I was bent on victory. I meant to give you a show, to make you sleep safe, or to be slain myself." Thank you very much. I look forward to Q&A.
Well, thank you very much for that, Andrew. And I think that is the first mention of Beowulf at the National Security Conference so far. But interestingly, drawing these allusions and these parallels with literature, with folklore, with history, is not entirely a new thing in this debate. I remember many years ago, in fact, Ross Babbage, a really prominent Australian strategic thinker, talked about a Beowulf context, a sort of an ability of Australia to be able to inflict serious damage on an adversary. And at the time, I have to, with full confession, I think 16 years ago, I was one of the commentators that kind of thought that was a slightly far-fetched idea for an Australia where at that time our region seemed to be headed for continued cooperation and peace. If Ross was in the room today, I'd probably apologise to him because I think he was a bit more prescient than a lot of us. But I want to go to your remarks and really your perspective, if I may. You talk about plain language. You talk about needing to really motivate, inform, inspire the population towards a really more joined-up approach to national security, as I see it. How do you balance that with diplomacy? How do you balance that with sending a message of reassurance to the region, including sending a message to China that Australia's not out to, if you like, provoke confrontation, that we are acting purely in self-defence? Do you see a balance to be struck there, and what is it?
Definitely, a balance to be struck is critical, and I don't want anyone to misconstrue that somehow I think that diplomacy is subordinate to military policy. I think it's an equal tool. I think the challenge for us at the moment is understanding that we have a significant threat, not just in our region, but there's a global threat. And to summarise it, it's autocracy versus democracy. I don't think that is a wild statement at all. I mean, Hal Brands essentially argues the same in this month's or this latest edition of Foreign Affairs. My point is, if we're going to talk about that behind closed doors and then do nothing in the public square to advocate for more defence expenditure, we're not going to be ready. And I think it is consensus, not just here in Australia, but across, at least in the US, the UK, and through our partners in the region, that we do need to be ready over the next decade. And at this stage, we're actually going backwards in defence. Inflation is eating into our purchasing power. and the Deputy Prime Minister has been unable to secure more funding for a defence budget that desperately needs it.
It'll be interesting to have this conversation again once the budget is out. Let's go a little bit more to your own, if you like, background, your motivations, what's inspired you in this space, because again, one of the themes of this conversation and of the conference is really developing the national security leadership for the future. And I think we were reflecting earlier, just as we came in here, about a particular mentor that we've both found pretty inspiring professionally. But I'd like to, without sort of putting words in your mouth, I'd be interested to get a sense of throughout your career from sort of soldier scholar into politics, and now where you are today, who in Australia has inspired you?
Well, some of you would know the late James Goldrick. He was my commandant at ADFA, and I wrote an essay in 2003, and I won an essay prize. And he decided to expose me to the strategic realm in 2004 as a 20-year-old. Took me to the United States to the Society for Military History in Bethesda. I got my first taste of the strategic realm as we went through customs in Sydney, where the then CDF Peter Cosgrove didn't have his passport. And we were following him through, and then all of a sudden he got stopped. His ADC had a meltdown, and we proceeded to board the flight. I heard Paul...
It wouldn't work like that nowadays.
No, definitely not. I had the opportunity to hear Paul Wolfowitz in Bethesda make a case for the invasion of Iraq only a year after it had happened. I was exposed to a whole bunch of scholars and foreign policy experts having a very lively debate at the time. And so James was very formative, I think, for me. And he always encouraged me. He said, soldiering and life in the Navy, it's probably 70% boredom, 30% action. And he said, so you need to build an interior life through wide reading and writing. And that was the advice he gave me, and that's something that I kept up. And that's kind of how that's what led me into politics, I suppose.
And just for those in the audience who may not know, James Goldrick, a very strong friend and supporter of the Australian national security community and the National Security College, a very distinguished naval officer and historian, passed away about a year ago. So we still think of him.
I never had a clue how James voted. In fact, he was scathing of politicians of all types. And I felt that at dinner over the last few years when we talk defence and foreign policy.
So back to you and the way your career has led you to the thinking that you have about national security today. I mean, you're an MP. I think your electorate in Western Australia has probably many more things to worry about than the national security landscape, but clearly that's one of those things. But of course, your military service, your career, your service in Afghanistan, and your prominent voice in the debate in more recent years, really about the legacy of that conflict and really the reputation and credibility of Australian forces from that conflict. And now, of course, as Shadow Minister for Defence, how have these building blocks accumulated for you in your worldview about Australian security?
I'm glad you mentioned Afghanistan, and I try not to talk about it too much, but it keeps following me.
We have a session later with Nick McKenzie talking about truth. That's going to be pretty fascinating, I think.
Very, very important. I suppose being at the pointy end of Australian defence and foreign policy and experiencing all the contradictions of that policy in a tactical setting as the ground force commander, where I literally had Afghan partner force trying to murder prisoners, and then having to come to a decision about how to deal with them whilst they're armed with AK-47s in the context of green on blue murders of our own troops. So you really start to feel the weight of things, and that motivated me to come to Canberra, because I thought, well, I can't just complain about these things in the officers' mess. If I want to make a difference, I should do something. So I came back and immediately joined the Liberal Party after my 2013 tour. You mentioned the legacy of Afghanistan. The vast majority of our troops served brilliantly, very professionally, and I'm very proud of what we achieved over there, given the strategic challenge of Afghanistan. But there were people who did the wrong thing. And I think one of the most important things for a democracy is to demonstrate that we can hold ourselves accountable. And I think we led the world with the Brereton report. And it's been a long, tough process. I think investigative journalism was also critical there. Sometimes when government fails, the fourth estate needs to step up, and I believe Nine Media did that, which is why I have been supportive of their work. But we're still dealing with that, and for some time. Yet I think the challenge for us is, as we pivot into great power competition, to close that off and to reconcile some of the things that we need to reconcile, but at the same time get the Defence Force ready. That's the challenge for people like me and others serving in government, like Richard Miles.
And I would note that with the community consultations that the college will be conducting, they'll be very wide-ranging, but they will include conversations with veterans. I know that when we spoke earlier, Andrew, you were very open to taking questions from the floor. However, time is incredibly tight. Yeah. What I will do is invite you back to the college on a future occasion. We will do a public event. There will be Q&A from the audience. So I just want to put that marker down now. In the meantime, I want to ask you one last question before we move to the next session, and that's really about Parliament and parliamentary awareness and understanding of national security issues. You've talked about, as you put it, the need for clarity to help the broader public understand the challenges and the ways in which we may need to respond as a nation. We have quite a wide range of your parliamentary colleagues participating in this conference, which I'm incredibly grateful for. The college does some engagement, some briefings with parliamentarians and their staff. Is there something you could say in broad terms or specific terms about how you see a need for fine-tuned parliamentary awareness of national security issues in these times?
Definitely. I chaired the Intelligence Committee for 4 years, and I've been advocating for a number of years alongside other colleagues like the late Jim Molan, Linda Reynolds, and others for a Joint Defence Committee, which effectively mirrors the Intelligence Committee, bounded by secrecy provisions, enabled by legislation, and parties of government serving on that committee. And I think defence is probably the toughest portfolio for a person to come into and start leading as a minister. $52 billion per year, thousands of people, lots of capabilities, lots of programs. And I think the benefit of a Joint Defence Committee will be that it'll provide a training ground for future ministers of defence. And at the moment, there is no such mechanism. There's no place where you have classified briefings given by defence. And I think in order to hold defence accountable, there has to be some form of parliamentary oversight. That doesn't exist at the moment. I'm conscious as well that current and former serving defence ministers might see it as a way of circumscribing their Westminster authority, but I think it would actually be a good support to them. You could throw your bureaucrats to the committee if they're not performing and put them under some questioning, for example. And I think defence needs to be held accountable. And I think also in the context of going to war again, during Afghanistan, if you look at the parliamentary record, there wasn't a great deal of debate about strategy in Afghanistan. And I think if we had a defence committee where behind closed doors, ministers and generals can be brought in and hard questions can be asked of operations and what's going on the ground without being accused of being disloyal to our troops or any of the other tropes that you might hear out there, I think that would be a very, very important thing. So the committee has an unblinking eye on defence policy and a training ground for future ministers, and something that could, I think, have a nice symmetry with what you do here at the college.
Look, Andrew, thank you very much. This has been short, but I think incredibly useful. So a standing invitation to come back to the college for a longer conversation, perhaps engaging with our audience as well. Some important messages there, not only about leadership, but also about the communication with the nation. I'll ask the audience now to join me in thanking Andrew Hastie MP.